October 24th, 1942. A darkness that only the jungle knows had fallen over Guadalcanal, a suffocating blackness made heavier by the ceaseless, drenching rain. Along a muddy ridge overlooking the Lunga River, young men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, huddled in their foxholes, their knuckles white as they gripped their rifles. They were exhausted, sick with malaria, and terrified. For days, they had listened to the jungle. It was alive with sounds that didn't belong, the faint clink of metal, the rustle of thousands of unseen bodies moving through the kunai grass, the guttural whispers in a language they didn't understand. They knew what was coming. The Japanese were out there, massing in the darkness, preparing to throw themselves at the thin American line in a human wave. The objective was Henderson Field, the vital airstrip wrested from the Japanese 2 months prior. For the Imperial Army, retaking it was a matter of absolute honor. For the Marines, holding it was the only thing that mattered. In a shallow, muddy gun pit at a crucial intersection of the line, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone checked his weapon for the 10th time. He wasn't a boy like the others. At 26, he was an old man in this company of teenagers. He was a professional soldier, a man who had found his home not in the quiet streets of Raritan, New Jersey, but in the disciplined, demanding world of the United States Marine Corps. He ran a calloused hand over the receiver of the Browning M1917 heavy machine gun, feeling the familiar coolness of the steel. This was his instrument, and he was a virtuoso. The kids in the foxholes around him knew it. They called him Manila John, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and reverence. It was a name earned 3 years earlier during his first enlistment in the army, serving in the Philippines. Even then, he had a reputation as a man who understood the brutal mechanics of warfare, a man who could make a machine gun sing a song of death. John was the 6th of 10 children, born to Italian immigrants in Buffalo, New York, and raised in the working-class town of Raritan. He was a restless youth, handsome and charismatic, but with a simmering intensity that the small-town life couldn't contain. He quit school at 15 to work in a local golf club, but his eyes were always on a wider world. In 1934, he found it, enlisting in the U.S. Army. It was in the sweltering heat of the Philippines that John Basilone the boy became Manila John the soldier. He served with the 31st Infantry, boxing in his spare time, earning a reputation as a tough, fair NCO who never asked his men to do something he wouldn't do himself. He loved the structure, the camaraderie, the clear sense of purpose. When his enlistment ended, he came home a different man, but civilian life chafed. He worked as a truck driver, but the quiet roads of Maryland felt empty compared to the disciplined rhythm of military life. The world was darkening as war spread across Europe and Asia, and John knew where he belonged. In 1940, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in Baltimore. He told the recruiter he wanted to be a machine gunner. It was the decision that would forge his legend. Now, in the Guadalcanal mud, he was the master of 2 machine gun sections, 16 men and 4 guns, positioned to anchor the entire defensive line of his battalion. His position, designated Hill 123, was the linchpin. If it fell, the Japanese could pour through, roll up the American flank, and swarm Henderson Field. Everyone knew it. The Japanese knew it most of all. The weapon at his command was a marvel of industrial warfare, the Browning M1917. It was a heavy, water-cooled beast, weighing over 90 pounds with its tripod and a full water jacket. Belt-fed, it could fire 600 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition per minute, a sustained, blistering rate of fire that could scythe down charging infantry like a farmer harvesting wheat. But it was a demanding weapon. It could jam from mud or away, verheating. The belts of ammunition were heavy and had to be fed smoothly. The water in the cooling jacket could boil away in minutes of continuous fire, causing the barrel to overheat and fail. Operating it required a team. a gunner to aim and fire, an assistant gunner to feed the belt and help clear jams, and ammunition bearers to haul the heavy ammo cans through the mud and chaos. It took strength, precision, and an almost mechanical coolness under fire. For John Basilone, handling the M1917 was as natural as breathing. He could break it down and reassemble it blindfolded. He knew the specific sound a jam made before it happened, the exact moment the water in the cooling jacket was about to boil over. He had trained his men relentlessly, drilling them until the operation of the gun was pure muscle memory. The strategic situation was dire. The 1st Marine Division was hanging on by a thread. For 2 months, they had endured Japanese naval bombardments, air raids, and constant sniper fire. Supplies were critically low. Their diet was a monotonous rotation of captured Japanese rice and the occasional tin of sea rations. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot were as much the enemy as the Japanese soldiers hiding in the trees. They were an army of ghosts, gaunt and yellowed by disease, but their resolve was like tempered steel. They held the perimeter around Henderson Field, a line carved out of the stinking primordial jungle. It was a world of giant banyan trees, tangled vines, and razor-sharp kunai grass that could slice a man's skin open. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the constant hum of insects. Now, Colonel Akinosuka Oka's Sendai Division, a veteran Japanese force of nearly 3,000 men, was coiled in the darkness before them. They were fresh, well supplied, and burning with the desire to annihilate the Marines and reclaim the island for the Emperor. Their doctrine was simple and terrifying: the banzai charge. They would attack at night, using overwhelming numbers and suicidal bravery to break the American line. They believed the individual American soldier was soft, lacking the spiritual will to stand against the irresistible tide of the Imperial Army. They were about to learn that Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone and the men of the 1st Marine Division were anything but soft. As the rain intensified, turning the foxholes into soupy graves, John moved between his 2 gun pits, his voice low and steady. He checked on his men, offering a quiet word of encouragement, a slap on the shoulder. He radiated a calm that seemed impossible in the face of the impending slaughter. He spoke to Corporal Joe Ginyard in one pit, to Sergeant Mitchell Page in another, ensuring every man knew his field of fire, knew his role. They were boys, many of whom had never seen combat before this God-forsaken island. They looked to him not just as a sergeant, but as a lifeline. His presence was a promise that they might just live to see the dawn. He knew the Japanese would come for his guns first. The heavy machine guns were the teeth of the defense. Silencing them was the primary objective of any assault. As he settled into the pit, peering into the impenetrable blackness, the sounds of the jungle suddenly changed. The chirping of insects and the croaking of frogs ceased, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence. Then, a new sound began to rise, a low, guttural chanting that grew in volume until it became a terrifying roar. From the darkness, flares shot into the sky, casting a ghastly green light over the landscape. And in that flickering, demonic glow, the Marines saw them. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, were rising from the kunai grass and charging straight for them. The battle for Henderson Field had begun. The roar was not human. It was the sound of a force of nature, a landslide of men and hate pouring out of the jungle. In the lurid green light of the flares, the first wave of Japanese soldiers seemed to rise from the very earth, a sea of bayonets bobbing above the tall grass. They ran with a strange, loping gait, their knees high, shouting "Te no heika banzai," "Long live the Emperor," a cry that was both a prayer and a death sentence. For the young Marines in their foxholes, it was the stuff of nightmares made real. This was the legendary banzai charge, an attack that relied on spiritual fervor and sheer mass to overwhelm the enemy. It was designed to induce terror, to make a man break and run. And for a terrifying moment, it almost worked. The line of riflemen wavered, their individual show. Ots sounding like pathetic pops against the thunderous wave of noise and bodies. From his gun pit, John Basilone watched the charge materialize and felt a cold, professional calm settle over him. He saw not a terrifying horde, but a tactical problem. He saw lanes of fire, intersecting arcs of death that he and his men had rehearsed 100 times. As the first Japanese soldiers hit the triple-strand concertina wire the Marines had strung across their front, he gave the order. Fire! The word was almost lost in the din, but his men didn't need to hear it. They felt it. The two M1917s on his left opened up, followed a split second later by the two on his right. The sound was a deafening, continuous rip, a mechanical scream that tore the night apart. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The heavy .30 caliber rounds hit the charging Japanese soldiers with the force of a sledgehammer. Bodies were thrown backward, spun around, and torn to pieces. The front ranks of the charge dissolved into a mangled heap of flesh and steel on the wire. But for every man who fell, 3 more seemed to rise from the jungle behind him, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, their bayonets gleaming in the flare light. The Japanese soldiers of the 4th Infantry Regiment, part of the famed Sendai Division, were not conscripts. They were professional soldiers, veterans of the campaigns in China, and they were utterly convinced of their own superiority. Their commander, Colonel Nomasu Nakaguma, had assured them that victory would be swift. They had been told the Americans were soft, materialistic, and would flee at the first taste of cold steel. Their doctrine was built on the concept of hakugeki, close-quarters combat, where the superior spirit of the Japanese soldier would triumph over the enemy's material advantage. They saw the machine guns not as an obstacle, but as a test of their courage. They would sacrifice themselves by the hundreds to silence those guns, believing that once the automatic weapons were gone, the American riflemen would break and be slaughtered in their holes. They ran directly into the fire, ignoring the casualties. Their focus, absolute. Their target was Manila John's position. The defensive line itself was a fragile thing, a shallow series of foxholes and gun pits, scraped into the crest of a long, muddy ridge. It was less a fortress and more a guideline in the dirt, a testament to the desperate shortage of manpower and equipment. The Marines of the 1st Battalion were stretched thin, with wide gaps between positions, covered only by the interlocking fields of fire from the machine guns. This was the thin red line of military legend, but here it was a line of olive drab, mud and blood. Basilone's 4 guns were the keystones in this fragile arch of defence. 2 guns, under his direct command, were positioned on a small knob of land that afforded them a clear view of the jungle flats. The other 2, commanded by Sergeant Mitchell Page, were placed slightly to the right, creating a deadly crossfire, a pocket of death into which the Japanese were now unhesitatingly charging. The engineers had done their part, stringing barbed wire and planting anti-personnel mines in the approaches. The mortar teams, positioned behind the ridge, had pre-registered their targets. On paper, it was a well-designed killing zone. But no plan had fully accounted for the sheer suicidal fanaticism of the Sendai Division. The first wave was annihilated. The second wave climbed over the dead and was also annihilated. The Browning machine guns grew hot, the smell of cordite mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the stench of the rain-soaked jungle. The water in the cooling jackets began to steam, then to boil, sending plumes of vapour into the night air that marked the guns' positions. The Japanese, seeing the steam, began to concentrate their fire. Knee mortars, the infamous knee-knocker grenade launchers, started to drop rounds with terrifying accuracy. Rifle fire, wild at first, became more directed. Bullets cracked inches over the gun pits, thudding into the sandbags. A Marine ammunition bearer, running from a supply trench with a heavy can of 30 caliber rounds, screamed and fell, his body riddled. The battle had become a brutal mechanical equation, the Marines' dwindling supply of ammunition against the Japanese' seemingly infinite supply of men. Then, the inevitable happened. In the pit next to John, a gunner named Corporal Joe Ginyard was firing a long, sustained burst when the gun suddenly fell silent. The belt had snagged. It was a common malfunction, but in the heat of battle, with hundreds of enemy soldiers charging your position, it was a death sentence. Ginyard and his assistant struggled with the feed mechanism in the dark, their hands clumsy with fear. The Japanese soldiers, seeing the gun go quiet, let out a triumphant roar and surged toward the weakened point in the line. Without hesitation, John Basilone left the relative safety of his own position. He grabbed a spare belt of ammunition and crawled on his belly through the thick mud, ignoring the bullets that snapped past his head. He reached Ginyard's pit, pushed the terrified assistant gunner aside, and went to work. His hands, acting with an intelligence of their own, moved with a surgeon's precision. He ripped the twisted belt from the feed pile, seated the new belt, pulled the charging handle twice, and slapped Ginyard on the back. "Get on it!" he yelled over the roar. The gun erupted back to life, stitching a line of death across the charging Japanese, who were now only yards from the barbed wire. The attack was relentless. There were no lulls, no pauses. It was a continuous, flowing river of men. The Japanese commanders, seeing their frontal assault failing, adapted. They began sending small teams of infiltrators to crawl through the gaps in the line, their objective to get behind the machine guns and destroy them with grenades. A grenade sailed through the air and landed in the foxhole of a young Marine rifleman, killing him instantly. Another exploded just behind a gun pit, showering the crew with mud and shrapnel. The Marines were now fighting in 360 degrees, firing to their front at the main charge while simultaneously whirling to shoot at shadows that had materialized behind them. The line was no longer a line, but a series of desperate, isolated islands of resistance in a sea of Japanese infantry. The neat geometry of the killing zone had dissolved into a chaotic, swirling melee. The air was thick with screams, both of pain and of fury, in English and in Japanese. The jungle itself seemed to be screaming. For the men on the ridge, the world had shrunk to the space of their foxhole, the weight of their rifle, and the terrifying certainty that death was crawling toward them in the darkness. John Basilone knew that the night was young, and the worst was yet to come. The Sendai Division had committed its first battalion. They still had 2 more. They were willing to sacrifice every last man to take this ridge, and John was beginning to realize that he and his small band of Marines might have to do the same to hold it, too. The second wave broke upon the wire and died there, but the tide of men was relentless. Colonel Nakaguma, furious at the resistance, committed his 2nd battalion, sending them crashing into the same meat grinder. The character of the fight changed. The Japanese were no longer just charging forward. They were flowing, like water seeking a crack in a dam. They exploited every gap, every moment a gun fell silent. The battle for the ridge devolved into 100 tiny, vicious firefights. For John Basilone, the world shrank to the narrow arc of his traversing fire and the chattering of the gun in his hands. He was no longer just a sergeant. He was the beating heart of the defense, a one-man force of will holding the line together. The barrels of his guns glowed a dull cherry red in the darkness. Cess and the water in the cooling jackets hissed away into the night as steam. The crisis came not from the enemy's bayonets, but from the simple, brutal logistics of war. The guns were hungry, devouring ammunition at an astonishing rate. The neatly stacked cans of .30 caliber rounds behind each gun pit, which had seemed like a generous supply hours before, were now terrifyingly low. The main ammunition dump was 100 yards back, down a muddy trail that was now swept by Japanese machine gun fire and crawling with infiltrators. To get there and back was a suicide run. As the last belt was fed into a gun, the assistant gunner looked at Basilone with wide, panicked eyes. "Sarge, we're out!" The words hung in the air, a death sentence. Without a moment of hesitation, John made a decision. He was the gunnery sergeant. His men, his guns, were his responsibility. He pointed at the two nearest men. "Keep 'em busy with your rifles!" he yelled. Then he vaulted over the back of the gun pit and disappeared into the darkness. The journey was a descent into hell. The air was a solid wall of noise and flying metal. Japanese soldiers were now behind the main line, firing from the jungle at the Marines' rear. John ran in a low crouch, his head down, mud sucking at his boots. He could hear their shouts, the guttural commands, sometimes just yards away. He was not just running through enemy fire, he was running through the enemy. He carried his Colt M1911 pistol, but he didn't dare fire it, lest he give away his exact position. He relied on speed, instinct, and the sheer audacity of his action. He reached the supply trench, where he found two terrified ammunition bearers huddled low. He didn't scream at them. His voice was a low, urgent growl that cut through their fear. "Get up! My guns are dry." He hefted two 20-pound cans of ammunition onto his shoulders, a crushing 40-pound load, and started back, the bearers following with more. The return trip was worse. He was a moving target, burdened and slow. A Japanese knee mortar exploded nearby, the concussion throwing him to the ground. His ears rang and hot shrapnel tore at his tunic, but he scrambled back up, hoisted the precious cans and staggered on. He arrived back at the gun pit, his lungs burning, his body screaming in protest, and dumped the ammunition on the ground. He didn't rest. He slapped a fresh belt into the gun, got it firing, and then turned to go back for more. He made that trip again and again through the night, a one-man supply chain fueled by pure grit. His hands were a wreck. In the frantic effort to keep the guns running, he performed battlefield maintenance that would have made an armourer weep. When a gun jammed, its feed mechanism fouled by mud and metal shavings from disintegrating belts, he didn't have time for tools. He reached into the breech with his bare hands, ignoring the searing heat of the metal, and ripped the stuck casings out. The skin on his palms and fingers blistered and peeled away, the pain a distant, unimportant signal from a body he was pushing far beyond its limits. At one point, a Japanese soldier, his face a mask of fury, managed to crawl through the wire and leap onto the edge of the gun pit, his bayonet held high. Before the man could lunge, John dropped the ammo can he was carrying, drew his .45, and shot him twice in the chest. He didn't even watch the body fall. He was already moving to the next gun, which had just fallen silent. The crew was dead. The gunner and his assistant lay slumped over their weapon, killed by a burst of machine gun fire. The Japanese, sensing another weak point, were massing for a charge. John dragged the bodies out of the pit with a grim reverence, then took the gunner's position himself. He cleared the jam, swung the heavy Browning toward the new threat, and opened fire. He was now operating a two-man weapon by himself, firing with one hand while feeding the ammunition belt with the other. The weight of the battle seemed to settle on his shoulders alone. He shouted orders to the remaining riflemen, directing their fire, his voice raw but unbroken. He was the anchor, the immovable object against which the irresistible force of the Sendai Division was breaking itself. As the first hints of a grey, rain-soaked dawn approached, the Japanese mounted their most furious assault yet. They came in a suicidal wave, screaming, firing from the hip, determined to overwhelm the last few defenders through sheer numbers. A grenade landed in the gun pit, and the explosion flipped the heavy M1917 and its tripod over, wrecking the mechanism beyond immediate repair. The position was defenseless. The Japanese swarmed over the sandbags. This was the moment of truth, the final test of Hakugeki, but they had not counted on Manila John. He threw the useless pistol aside, its magazine empty, and grabbed the only weapon left, a razor-sharp machete. As the first Japanese soldier jumped into the pit, John met him with a brutal upward swing that nearly took the man's head off. He fought like a cornered animal, a whirlwind of mud-caked fury. He used the machete with terrifying efficiency, hacking and slashing in the confines of the pit. He was no longer a technician of war. He was a primal warrior, defending his ground with cold steel. The long night finally ended. As the sun rose, casting a sickly light over the shattered landscape, the Japanese attacks faltered and then ceased. The survivors of the Sendai Division melted back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. John Basilone, his hands raw and bleeding, his uniform in tatters, stood up in the gun pit and surveyed the scene. The sight was apocalyptic. The ground in front of his position was not just littered with bodies, it was a solid carpet of them, piled 3 and 4 deep on the barbed wire. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead in a perfect fan-shaped arc, a testament to the devastating power of the machine guns. Of the 16 men in his 2 sections, only John and 2 others were left standing, wounded but alive. For nearly 48 hours against a force of 3,000 men, they had held the line. They had faced the crucible and had not been consumed. The shock was not that they had won, but that they had survived at all. The legend of Manila John was born in that bloody mud, a story of endurance that bordered on the impossible. The dawn brought not relief, but a stunned, silent horror. The scale of the slaughter was incomprehensible. The jungle floor was a charnel house, a landscape sculpted from death. The air, thick with the cloying sweet smell of blood and cordite, hung heavy and still. John Basilone, caked in mud and gore from head to foot, looked out from his pit. He was running on something beyond adrenaline, a state of pure, exhausted survival. He helped the medics with the few wounded who could be saved, his movements stiff and mechanical. He couldn't process what had happened. He could only function. The bodies of his men, boys he had trained and mentored, lay where they had fallen. He had held the line, but the cost was staggering. When his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, a man not given to sentiment or exaggeration, came to inspect the position, he simply stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the carpet of Japanese dead and the handful of survivors. He walked over to Basilone, put a hand on his shoulder, and said in a voice choked with emotion, "You have held a regimental front with a platoon of men." It was the highest praise a Marine could receive. News of the stand on Guadalcanal travelled fast. In the desperate early days of the war, America was starved for heroes, for proof that its sons could stand against the seemingly invincible armies of the Axis. The story of Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, the tough machine gunner who had held off a regiment, was a tonic for a nervous nation. It was a tale of raw courage, of a single man's will against impossible odds. The Marine Corps, recognizing the immense propaganda value of his actions, awarded him the nation's highest decoration for valor, the Medal of Honor. And with it, they made a decision. Manila John was too valuable a symbol to risk in further combat. His war, they decided, was over. He was being sent home. The journey from the mud of Guadalcanal to the polished floors of Washington, D.C. was more disorienting than any battle. John was cleaned up, given a new uniform, and put on a series of planes that carried him back across the world. He left behind the stench of death and entered a world of parades, press conferences, and polite applause. It was a world he didn't understand and didn't trust. He was no longer a sergeant. He was a celebrity. When the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck by President Franklin Roosevelt in a solemn White House ceremony, John stood ramrod straight, his face an unreadable mask. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was being honored for what he saw as simply doing his job, for surviving a night of unimaginable horror that had claimed the lives of men he respected. The medal felt heavy, not with the weight of honor, but with the weight of their memory. he was immediately assigned to the war bond tour. It was a critical mission for the home front. The war effort required staggering sums of money, and the government relied on selling war bonds to its citizens to finance the production of ships, tanks, and planes. To sell those bonds, they needed to sell the war, and to sell the war, they needed heroes. John Basilone became the face of that effort. He was paired with Hollywood stars, ushered onto stages in packed stadiums, and pushed in front of microphones in bustling city squares. He was handsome, charismatic, and authentic, a genuine hero from a real battlefield. The crowds adored him. They cheered his name, mobbed him for autographs, and bought bonds by the millions after hearing his reluctant, heavily censored accounts of combat. Women swooned over him. One town in his home state of New Jersey held a John Basilone Day parade that drew 30,000 people. He was offered a movie contract, endorsement deals, a life of comfort and fame that was the stuff of American dreams. But for John, it was a waking nightmare. He hated it. He hated the speeches, the insincere handshakes from politicians, the fawning attention. He felt like a fraud, a trained SEAL performing for audiences who could never comprehend the reality of what he had seen. They cheered for a sanitized version of war, a Hollywood fantasy of noble sacrifice. They didn't see the mud, the flies, the terror. They didn't smell the jungle rot or the blood. He would stand on stage under the warm, bright lights, and in his mind, he would be back on that dark, rain-swept ridge, the screams of his men echoing in his ears. The applause sounded hollow, an obscene counterpoint to the memory of his machine gun's deadly chatter. He felt a profound and suffocating guilt. Why was he here, safe and celebrated, while his brothers were still out there, fighting and dying in the Pacific? The Medal of Honor, meant to be a symbol of his bravery, began to feel like a chain, tying him to a life he didn't want. He tried to play the part. He smiled for the cameras, repeated the lines they gave him, and urged people to buy bonds. But his discomfort was palpable. In newsreel footage from the time, his eyes are haunted, his smile forced. He was a warrior trapped in a salesman's suit. He confided in the few people he trusted that he felt like he was hiding out. The war wasn't over for him. He had made a promise to his men, the unspoken pact of a combat NCO, that he would be there with them, that he would lead them, that he would share their fate. Every parade, every banquet, was a betrayal of that pact. He began to push back. He petitioned his superiors, formally requesting a return to active combat duty. The Marine Corps, stunned, refused. "You're too valuable here, Gunny," they told him. "You're doing more for the war effort selling bonds than you could with a machine gun." But John saw it differently. He wasn't a symbol, he was a Marine. His place was not on a stage. It was with a platoon of young men who needed his experience and his leadership. His resolve hardened. He became more insistent, using the leverage his fame afforded him. He told the Marine Corps brass that if they didn't let him go back to the fleet, he would start talking. Not just about buying bonds, but about what the war was really like, about what the men at the front needed. The thinly veiled threat worked. The last thing the carefully managed propaganda effort needed was America's greatest war hero going off script. Reluctantly, the Corps hierarchy relented. They gave him a choice. He could remain stateside as an instructor, a safe and respectable post for a Medal of Honor recipient. Or if he was truly determined, they would grant his request to return to the operating forces. The choice, for John, was no choice at all. He didn't want to teach young Marines how to fight. He wanted to lead them. He asked for an assignment to a combat unit preparing to ship out. In late 1943, he was assigned to Camp Pendleton, California, to train men of the newly formed 5th Marine Division. The war bond tour was over. Manila John was going back to war. He knew the odds. He knew that a man who had survived Guadalcanal was already living on borrowed time. But for him, A hero's welcome in a safe country was a gilded cage. True honor, he believed, wasn't found in parades and medals, but in the mud and the fear, standing alongside his fellow Marines. He was trading guaranteed survival for a near-certain death, and he had never been more certain of his decision in his life. At Camp Pendleton, under the warm California sun, John Basilone found a piece of the life he had left behind. He was a gunnery sergeant again, not a celebrity, and his work was real. He was tasked with training the raw recruits of the 5th Marine Division, boys from farms and cities who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and who looked at him with undisguised hero worship. They had read about him in magazines, seen him in newsreels. To them, he was not a man, but a myth walking among them. He trained them with a relentless intensity, drilling the mechanics of the machine gun into their souls, just as he had with his men on Guadalcanal. He knew that their lives depended on the muscle memory he was forging in them now, on this peaceful American base. He was hard on them, demanding perfection, because he knew what waited for them across the ocean. It was here, amidst the dust and the shouted commands, that he met Sergeant Lena Riggi, a Marine in the Women's Reserve. She was a fellow Italian-American, tough, smart, and utterly unimpressed by his celebrity status. She saw not the hero, but the man, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the profound loneliness he carried. For the first time since leaving the Philippines years before, John allowed himself to think of a future that didn't involve a battlefield. They fell in love quickly, a wartime romance defined by a shared sense of duty and the unspoken knowledge that their time together was borrowed. They were married in July of 1944. In the wedding photos, John is smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that had been absent for years. He had found a reason to live, a life to come home to, but he knew, and Lena knew, that first he had a promise to keep. The men he had trained were shipping out for the Pacific, for an island the world had never heard of called Iwo Jima, and he was going with them. He turned down a commission as an officer, requesting to remain a gunnery sergeant. He didn't want to command from the rear. He wanted to be on the line with his men. February 19th, 1945. The black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima's Red Beach, too, were a vision of hell. The landing craft slammed against the shore, and the ramps dropped into a churning surf of ash and blood. The Marines of the 27th Regiment charged out into a storm of steel. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had turned the island into a fortress, a subterranean labyrinth of pillboxes, blockhouses, and hidden artillery positions, all with interlocking fields of fire zeroed in on the beaches. The beach was a death trap. Mortar rounds rained down from the sky, while heavy machine guns, hidden in concrete bunkers, swept the black sand with murderous, crisscrossing fire. There was no cover. The volcanic ash was soft and loose, impossible to dig a foxhole in. Men were cut down the moment they left the landing craft. The advance stalled before it began, the first waves pinned down, caught between the relentless sea and the unblinking eye of Mount Suribachi, which loomed over the battlefield like a malevolent god. John Basilone hit the beach with his men and saw the situation instantly. They were trapped, being systematically slaughtered. His unit was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer volume of fire coming from a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse at the edge of the airfield. Young Marines, the same boys he had trained in the California sun, were dying all around him. The myth of Manila John was about to meet the reality of Iwo Jima. But this was not Guadalcanal. This was not a defense. This was an assault, and his men needed a leader. In that moment, the hero of the Bon Tour vanished, and the combat NCO took over. He knew that staying on the beach meant death. The only way to survive was to move forward, to attack. He turned to his terrified men, his voice cutting through the cacophony of battle. "Come on, you sons of bitches! We gotta get off this beach!" He didn't wait for a response. He began to move, not recklessly, but with a cold, calculated purpose. He crawled and ran, using the blasted ruins of destroyed vehicles for cover, making his way toward the blockhouse that was pinning everyone down. He was a one-man assault team. He reached a point where he was close enough, pulled the pins on 2 grenades, and with a powerful heave, sent them sailing through the firing slit of the bunker. The explosions were followed by a brief, blessed silence from the machine gun. But it wasn't enough. He waved 2 of his men forward, carrying demolition charges. Under his direction, they placed the charges at the base of the blockhouse and blew it to pieces, silencing the position for good. He had broken the stalemate, but there were other positions, a whole network of them. Nearby, a group of American Sherman tanks was struggling, unable to advance through a minefield under heavy fire. John, acting as if he were immune to the bullets and shrapnel that filled the air, ran to the lead tank. He got the commander's attention and, using hand signals, began to guide the tank, walking in front of it through the treacherous minefield. He was completely exposed, a single figure of defiance against the entire Japanese defense. He directed the tank's 75mm cannon, pointing out targets, watching as the powerful shells smashed into Japanese pillboxes. He led them to the edge of the airfield, clearing a path for the infantry to follow. In 20 minutes of furious, focused violence, he had single-handedly broken the back of the Japanese defenses in his sector. His men, inspired by his impossible courage, had rallied and were now moving off the beach, advancing inland. He had done it. He had gotten his men through the killing zone. For a brief moment, he paused at the edge of the airfield to organize them for the next push. He was their gunnery sergeant, and his job was to lead. It was in that moment that his luck, which had carried him through the jungles of the Philippines, the bloody ridge of Guadalcanal, and the horrors of Red Beach, finally ran out. A Japanese mortar round, one of thousands that fell on the island that day, screamed down from the sky. It exploded almost on top of him. The concussion and shrapnel tore through him, and he fell to the black sand. He was killed almost instantly. Manila John, the legend who had refused to die, the hero who had turned his back on fame to return to his men, was gone. The legacy of John Basilone is unique in the annals of American military history. He is the only enlisted Marine in World War II to have received both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross, the latter awarded posthumously for his actions on Iwo Jima. But his legend is not built on medals. It is built on a choice. He chose to trade a life of safety and adoration for a soldier's death. He ran from his own myth, from the comfortable life of a celebrated hero, and chose instead the harsh, brutal reality of combat leadership. On Guadalcanal, he became a legend by holding the line, a symbol of immovable defense. On Iwo Jima, he cemented that legend by leading the charge, a symbol of unstoppable offense. He was a man who understood that the greatest honor was not being celebrated by strangers, but being trusted by the men to his left and his right. He died as he had lived, a gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, leading from the front, his duty to his men his only sacred creed. The hero's welcome had been a detour. His true home was always the front line, and it was there, on the black sands of Iwo Jima, that Manila John finally made his last stand.